I'm thinking about, the average person who is wanting to start creating content online. Maybe it's a blog, maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a YouTube channel. What are some things you would recommend based on what you learned?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that I try to convey in the book is in the first chapter, which also seems to be the thing that has resonated the most with a lot of people, which is this idea of finding your differentiator. This sounds really obvious because we all think that whatever we've created is special and has some sort of differentiator. But I see this most often with content. And the thing that I'm going to go over is not true for only content, but it's where I see people miss the mark the most. Meaning, if you think about different products that exist, right? Like a fintech app or your new iPhone, whatever it might be, there's a reason that you bought it. And it's not because it's a phone. It's not because it's a fintech app. It's not because it's a fridge. It's because, oh, I really love Apple because their UI is so easy to
Mm,
use. Or I feel like this brand is high quality, whatever it might be. There's a reason that we buy from certain brands versus others. And it's not always because of the utility. It's because of the brand. It's because of the differentiator and the way that we view it, that particular product. The same thing is true with content, meaning that where a lot of people go wrong is they think through what they're writing about way more than how it's different. Again, this sounds obvious,
mm,
but I can guarantee I can pick out most content properties out there today, and they haven't gone through this exercise. So a lot of the time people will come to me and they'll say, "Hey, Steph, I'm thinking of starting a newsletter. Can you let me know what your thoughts are?" And I go, "Okay, sure." And they say, "I'm writing a newsletter about travel. What do you think?" And I'm like, I literally have zero clue whether this is going to be successful because it could range from being completely unsuccessful, 0 subscribers, to being the most successful newsletter in the travel space because I have no idea how you're going to actually differentiate within this
mm,
space.
right.
Now, this relates to another point, which is that a lot of the time, this is the same thing for most startups out there. People look for areas where no one is. And that's also not a good idea because
Right.
that typically signals that there is no demand for that thing. And so it's not a bad thing to enter a competitive space like travel or like startup news or whatever it might be, but to very, very clearly be able to articulate how you're going to do it differently.
Mm,
And these differentiators can be very, very simple. So, for example, Charter is a newsletter that started in the business and tech news space years after many of the other ones existed, like The Hustle or Morning Brew. And their differentiator was very simply that it was more visual, or you could actually use that as a proxy for being more concise, right? So
right.
instead of having to read a really long form email about business and tech news, they have around 3 or so infographics. And there is some text, but it's really, really short, really sweet, really shareable as well,
Mm,
which meant that they grew like crazy. I don't know exactly how big they are, but I'm positive that they have hundreds of thousands of subscribers today. And I believe they started in either 2018 or I think it actually might have been 2019. So they grew like a weed. Now you can be different in many different ways. You can be funnier, you can be more contrarian, you can be more concise, more thoughtful. There are so many different adjectives, and that's the key. It's an adjective that you associate with a particular brand, right? And this is
mm,
true again for writing. And it's also important because it's not just about being differentiated. The way that you're differentiated is also your growth vector, meaning that when someone tells someone else about your newsletter, they're never going, "Hey, I love this newsletter." And they go, "Why?" And the person doesn't say, "Oh, it's because it writes about technology." Have you ever heard that in your life
mhm,
before? No,
right.
because so many things write about technology, so many things write about sports, so many things write about travel. What you do hear them say is, "You have to listen to this podcast. It's so funny." Or, "You got to read this article on crypto. I've never seen it go this deep and be this, like, this analysis is so much different, so has so much more depth than anything else I've read about this particular topic."
Mm,
And so don't focus on the topic. Pick a topic that you know well that can allow you to have this differentiator. The same way that if you learn languages, I can only speak English, unfortunately, but I've heard that once you start learning languages to an extent, that you truly know it, then you can start incorporating humor into it because you have the flexibility, you have the
mm,
foundation. And so the same thing is true about finding topics. It is important to talk about things that you know a lot about because that allows you to differentiate, allows you to bring in humor or whatever your differentiator might be. And I'll just close this out by saying that again, this is true not just for content products, but for all products, all companies out there, but it's what people forget the most with content. And to give an example of one company that's done this really well, which is again, not a content company, but we can learn from it, is Costco. So Costco went into something that was very, very saturated, general retail after a lot of other brands already existed in that space. And most people would tell them, you're not going to succeed. But what
Right.
they did is they said, what are all the things that people might care about with a general retail store, whether it might be cost or package sizes or location, service, etc. And they said, we're going to be the best at one thing. And we forget it because it's even in their name and it's cost. But Costco said, we're going to be the absolute best at this one thing, which is cost, and we're going to trade off the rest. So they have huge package sizes. That's a no in theory, right? They don't have much brand diversity because of those huge package sizes.
Ugly ass warehouse stores.
Ugly ass warehouse stores,
Yeah,
no
exactly.
service workers helping you out.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
hard to get to locations because they're big, sizable
Mm,
factory style locations. And they did all of this actually because it all filters back into cost.
mm.
So now everyone knows them as this is the most cost centric place that I can shop. And people talk about that. People love Costco. They say, this $1.50 hot dog, I love it. And so the point is that it's really, really easy for people to associate an adjective with Costco. It's
Right.
cheap. And they don't try to be everything on top of that. They just try to be cheap. And it's important for writers to do the same thing. What is the
Mm.
one thing where if someone were to go to their friend and talk about your work, how would they describe it? And what is that one adjective that they would describe it with? And if you can't articulate it, I can bet you no one else can articulate it. And so just go, if you're a writer, if you're creating content, this is like the one thing that people skip over that really does make the difference. So spend time on this, sit down and just think through what is my differentiator? What is my one adjective? And if you don't know it, then spend time adjusting your content so that is clear.
Yeah, that's so good. I feel like, I mean, for you, what did you find? Like, what in your when you're approaching like, what was your differentiator when writing this book? Like for you, because I'm curious about that in practice. Because I do think like it reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you've heard the podcast, You Are a Storyteller.
I
Um,
haven't, no.
it's really good. But Brian McDonald, he's going to be a guest on the show in the next couple of months. But he's this amazing storyteller. He's worked with Disney and Pixar and all this stuff, and he's like this just like guru when it comes to writing amazing stories. But he has this idea about armature, which is kind of like you could exchange that word for theme. And basically, like, you have to decide like what the theme of your story is, and then that informs everything else that you do. So like his example was like Jaws, the movie. It wasn't about a big shark. It was about a man overcoming his fear of the water. Like that's ultimately what Jaws was really about. And everything was pointing back to that one idea and that one armature, that one theme. And so I think for me, that was a really helpful framework of like, so what's my theme? Like, what is my,
I like that. I
and
haven't
as,
heard that before.
yeah, and it's really nice because it kind of, he then, suggests that you stop then trying to make up things that fit within your theme. It's just you're discovering what you need in order to tell the fuller story of your theme. So like every decision from then on moving forward, to your point about Costco, they had their theme of like, we want to be the most value driven, cheap brand ever. And so every decision they made, making really ugly, hard to get to giant warehouses where you buy pallets of oatmeal or whatever,
Yeah.
like that totally was informed by this bigger story that they were trying to tell. And it worked really well.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like for you, do you have any thoughts or examples around that? Like for someone maybe just starting, like how did you find your theme or what did that look like for you?
Yeah. And to your point, it's this idea of one decision makes a thousand decisions.
Mm,
So once you've really identified what your North Star is, you've actually eliminated so many decisions from your life because you're not then pondering, how do we interpret this situation? It's just very, very clear. I will say, taking a step back from even the book, I would say my theme in my work overall, whether it's my podcasts or books or different articles that I've written in the past, is this idea that I basically am constantly trying to reinvent myself. And that's not on a public scale, as in constantly trying to learn new things in my own life and master them, whether it's learning to code, whether it's creating content properties. And what I've chosen to do is share as much of that as possible. And I want that to continue to be true. And so I think the way that ends up coming out in my work is that I've heard people say that, for example, a lot of the articles I write are really approachable. And the reason that they're approachable is because I've done everything I read about. So I don't
mm,
go and research topics that someone else has done and then report on them. I do that a little bit through the work that I've done at the hustle. But in terms of my own work and my own brand, I only ever write about things or talk about things that I've done from a first primary user perspective.
Hmm.
And so that, I guess, maybe isn't the perfect answer to like, what is your theme? But I guess my theme is to go and like constantly evolve through my life, learn new things, and then be willing to share those things pretty openly and transparently so that other people can learn those same things. And I've done that from the beginning. When I started, I guess, building a brand, the intention wasn't building a brand. It was, I wanted to talk about remote work in ways that I
Hmm.
hadn't seen people do before. I've been working remotely for 3 to 4 years by that point. I think that's right, at least a couple of years. And I just, there were certain things that I wanted to say that I wasn't seeing being said. And so that was my nudge to go and create a blog and start talking about things. And then a lot of the early articles I wrote then were about how I found a remote job, which again was from primary perspective and how I see that space evolving. And so that, I would say, is always where I start, at least
Hmm.
for my personal brand, is what have I learned? What am I excited about that I can then go and share from this primary perspective, which doesn't need to be the case for other people. But to your question, like once I've developed this, it's very, very clear to me what types of things I'm going to write about. And then it also does actually kind of solve a bunch of different other questions, because all these other topics that maybe are interesting, but I don't have a primary perspective on, I just eliminate. I just don't even think through whether I'm going to write about them because I've already made that decision.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so good. I think that's really cool. Especially the reinvention piece. I think that's really neat. I think for me, I'll since you shared yours, I'll share what I've thought
Yeah,
about from
please
mine.
do.
I mean, for me, it's I've struggled my whole life with insecurity, just feeling very like an insecure person, and especially with creative work, it's a very vulnerable space to kind of put yourself out there. And I know a lot of my friends and peers, and I think insecurity is just a very human experience. Pretty much anybody can feel that at any point. But I think for me, what I came to, and this really came to a head when I decided to let go of the last podcast I was doing and come back to make something cool, was that ultimately I think my personal theme for myself is to defeat insecurity and make something cool. And then that just like rung true of like I want to help other people defeat their insecurity so they can make something cool. And
I
like
love
that,
that.
yeah, and it's just like that one very simple idea and theme is like, cool. Now everything else is kind of clarified now. Like, all right, if it's gonna help me defeat insecurity and make something cool, do it. And if it's gonna help somebody else, do it. Like that. And I learned that from listening to Brian and thinking like, what's the armature of what I'm doing and that theme. And I think that that kind of is the decision that makes 1,000 decisions now, which is really helpful.
Yeah, and it relates to this idea of like, how is your content different? So once you've isolated that, I feel like probably if you go ask your listeners, your readers, they'd be like, oh, Alex's stuff is so vulnerable or it feels so transparent. There's probably something that they can associate with that because you have this very clear vision or approach to your work where you're really trying to help other people like get past that level of insecurity. And so if you're doing that effectively, then you will hear a resonance in
Mm,
people's feedback around what you're doing. And that's what I also would encourage people to listen for, is not just to sit, in your room and determine your adjective, but see if that adjective maps out to what people say. And you should see that. You should see patterns where actually I wrote this book about finding a differentiator, or at least that being a chapter in it. And naturally that was a question that people started asking. They said, well, what's your differentiator when your work? And it
mhm,
was a little hard for me at first because again, my work is a little scattered in terms of the projects that I've done. And what I did to really isolate that is I thought back to the feedback that I've gotten in the past, the unsolicited feedback when people DM me or they add a podcast review without me prompting them. What are the things that they're saying? And is there a resonance? Is there a theme to
mhm.
what people get from my work versus what they might get from other people's work? And so I would encourage people and yourself as well to just look for that and then double down on whatever that is coming across as.
Yeah, that's so cool. I had a friend write me and he reached out to a bunch of his closest friends and was like, "If you could describe me in one word," or something. And we all wrote back. And I think he was doing it as like a thought experiment for himself and his brand that he was trying to work on. But I thought that was actually really cool because it wasn't just, to your point, him sitting in a room, imagining what he wishes he was. It was like actually gathering feedback about those closest to him. What do you actually like? And what are you like? And what do you enjoy doing? And what energy do you put into the world? I think that's a really smart thing to think about instead of just, I've done that a million times too, where I just sit And I imagine, well, what do I want to be like? I think that there's like, how many people are trying to be like, I don't know, James Clear is a great example. There's only
Yeah.
one James Clear, and he's clarified exactly what he's doing. But how many people are just thinking, well, that's the right direction to go. I should be like that. It's like, no, you have your own unique voice to share with the world. And that's worth finding out exactly what that is.
Yeah, this actually relates to I listened to a Tim Ferriss episode yesterday, and he talked about this idea that really resonated with me, which he basically said, you have a personal brand. Every single person on this earth has a personal brand, even if they don't have what we often think of as a personal brand. And that personal brand is the way that people closest to you think of you. So, as your friend did, like, what are the adjectives that their friends would describe them as? And most of the time, whatever that true personal brand is, really, really does end up reflecting into your larger personal brand. And if it doesn't, it's going to feel really unnatural
Mm.
as you go build this personal brand and you try to portray yourself in a certain way. It's just going to feel really unnatural to you and to your listeners, your readers, or whatever. And it's going to be really hard, right? Because it's really hard to live, even though it's not maybe a lie, but live this narrative of how you want other people to portray you. And so, one of the best ways if people are thinking through, like, how could I build a wider personal brand? How could I grow my personal brand? Is starting exactly as your friend did by asking, what is my existing personal brand? Because I have one. People interpret me in a specific way. And
Mhm.
there are certain things that jump out to people about me. And how can I utilize those things that already exist and just maybe elevate them a little further in my work instead of trying to invent what I think other people might care about?
Mm.
Because that, again, it's just going to be really unnatural. And anything unnatural is just additional friction in your
Right.
work that doesn't need to exist.